On the morning of January 14th, 1887, the thermometer nailed to the north post of the Bergstrom Mercantile in Cottonwood Falls, Minnesota Territory, read 42 degrees below zero. The mercury had bottomed out sometime in the night and would not begin its slow climb back until well past noon. 3 feet of dry, wind-driven snow lay packed against every standing structure in the settlement, and the air itself, when breathed deeply, carried a sharp metallic burn that pioneers of that era simply called the iron cold. Inside the abandoned laundry house at the eastern edge of town, a long, narrow, sod-roof building that had stood empty and rotting for nearly 4 years, a woman named Astrid Halvorsen was pouring a second cup of coffee. The interior held steady at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. A single small stove, fed only twice in the previous 12 hours, supplied the heat. The temperature differential between the inside of that converted laundry house and the open air beyond its walls was 95 degrees. When the 4 neighbors arrived at her door that morning, Tobias Lindgren, his brother Per, the widow Margit Sorensen, and the schoolmaster Daniel Whitcomb, they did not arrive to visit. They arrived to recover a body. The temperature had been brutal for 9 consecutive days. Astrid Halvorsen was 47 years old, lived alone, and had moved into a structure the entire town had condemned as unfit for storage, let alone human habitation. The men carried a length of wool blanket between them. They had agreed, walking out, that they would not let Margit go in first. Tobias knocked. He waited. He knocked again, louder, the cold burning the knuckles of his glove. The door opened, and a wave of warm air rolled out into the yard so visibly that all 4 of them stepped back. Astrid stood in the doorway in a wool dress and a single shawl. No coat, no overboots, no mittens. Behind her, in the dim interior, a kettle steamed on a small black stove. The walls, where the men could see them through the open door, looked strange, layered, doubled, padded somehow, but the men were not looking at the walls. They were feeling the heat that poured past her into the yard and disappeared instantly into the killing air. "You'd best come in," she said, "before the cold gets all the way through the door." Per Lindgren would later tell his children that he had stood at that threshold for what felt like a full minute, unable to make sense of what his body was telling him. Outside, the cold could kill an unprotected man in 20 minutes. Inside, it was warmer than his own cabin, where 2 stoves burned around the clock and his wife still wore wool gloves to knead bread. Astrid Halvorsen had been a nurse for 22 years. She had walked the wards of the Minneapolis County Hospital through 3 cholera outbreaks, 2 diphtheria epidemics, and the long, slow years of caring for veterans broken by the war. In the spring of 1886, she had been dismissed without pension after a dispute with the hospital's new physician administrator over the treatment of indigent patients. She lost her position, her room in the hospital boarding house, and the small savings she had kept in the hospital's own ledger account, which the new administration declared forfeit. By autumn, she had ridden west on a borrowed wagon with 2 trunks, a sewing basket, and $17. She arrived in Cottonwood Falls in October. She had no family there. She had no land claim. She had only the address of a cousin who had died the previous spring without leaving word. The town offered her one option for shelter before winter closed the roads: an abandoned laundry house at the eastern edge of the settlement, owned by the bank and considered worthless. 3 previous occupants had attempted to winter in it. 2 had abandoned it within a month. 1 had nearly died. Astrid Halvorsen accepted the keys on October 19, 1886. She had 86 days until the first night the temperature would drop below zero and stay there. When her 4 neighbors stepped through her door on that January morning and felt the impossible warmth, none of them understood yet what they were standing inside. None of them yet understood the system she had built into those rotting walls, or the principle she had borrowed from 22 years of watching how human bodies held heat in cold hospital wards, or the silent late autumn weeks she had spent salvaging materials from the very town that had now come to bury her. But 3 months earlier, every single one of those neighbors had laughed. Go back to the morning of October 20th, 1886, the day after Astrid took possession of the building. The structure she had been given was not a cabin. It was a commercial laundry house, built in 1879 by a Norwegian widow who had operated it for railroad crews until the line shifted south in 1882. It was 42 feet long and 16 feet wide, far larger than any reasonable winter shelter. The walls were single-thickness pine plank, gone gray and soft along the lower courses. The roof was sod laid over rough rafters, sagging in two places where the support timbers had begun to rot. There was a stone chimney on the south wall, cracked through in 3 places. The floor was packed dirt with rotting plank laid down in patches. Wind moved through the building as freely as it moved across the prairie outside. When Tobias Lindgren stopped by that first morning, ostensibly to offer neighborly welcome, he stood in the open doorway and looked the length of the empty building and shook his head. "You want to seal off about 8 feet of it," he said. "Build yourself a small room at the south end, against the chimney. The rest you let go. You can't heat this whole building." No one could. It was honest, decent advice. It was also the conventional wisdom of every settler in the region. The standard frontier response to a cold weather shelter problem was simple. Shrink the heated volume. Build small. Build tight. Burn wood against the cold, and accept that you would still be cold. Astrid thanked him. She did not tell him that she intended to do the opposite. Within a week, word had traveled through the settlement that the new woman at the old laundry house was doing strange things. She had not built a partition. She had not abandoned the long building for a smaller corner. Instead, she was walking the town with a hand wagon every morning, collecting things no one else wanted. Old wool batting from a torn-down mattress at the boarding house, the ash residue from the blacksmith's forge, sawdust from the lumber yard's discard pile, newspaper bundles from the mercantile's back room, reeds and cattail down from the slough at the south edge of town, clay from a cut bank along the creek. What those neighbors didn't yet understand was a principle Astrid Halvorsen had learned not from a building manual, but from 22 years of watching pneumonia patients survive winter wards heated only by a single stove at the far end of a 30-foot room. And that explanation is where this story truly begins to make sense. For the moment, though, the town only saw the strangeness. The schoolmaster Daniel Wickham, walking past her building in early November, stopped to ask if she needed help with a proper partition. She told him no. He looked past her into the long interior and saw what looked like a second wall being built 4 inches inside the first wall, with the cavity being slowly packed with layers of newspaper, sawdust, wool, and clay. He had never seen anything like it. He walked away thinking the woman was either a fool or had simply given up and was occupying her hands until the cold finished her. By the second week of November, the laughter had started. Not cruel laughter. The frontier was not cruel in that way, but the rueful, head-shaking laughter of people who believed they were watching someone make a fatal mistake. Per Lindgren told his wife that the woman would be dead by Christmas. Margit Sorensen, who had buried 2 husbands and knew winter, brought over a loaf of bread and a kind warning. The building was too big, the walls too thin, the chimney too cracked. There was still time, Margit said, to build a proper small room. Astrid thanked her and accepted the bread. What no one in Cottonwood Falls knew was that Astrid had spent 4 nights of that first week not sleeping in the building at all, but pacing it with a tallow candle, watching the way the flame moved. She had learned in the hospital wards that air movement was the enemy of warmth. A drafty ward killed patients no matter how hot the stove burned. A still ward, even a cool one, kept people alive. She was mapping every place in the laundry house where the candle flame bent, every gap, every seam, every place the prairie wind found its way in. She wrote those locations down in pencil on the back of a hospital discharge ledger, the only paper she had brought west. By November 14th, the first hard frost arrived. By the 21st, the ground was frozen. By December 3rd, the temperature dropped below zero for the first time and did not climb back above it for 41 consecutive days. The town settled into its long siege. Stoves burned hot. Wood piles diminished faster than their owners had planned. Pipes froze in 3 different homes. A child in the Hauser family developed pneumonia and was carried, wrapped in 3 quilts, to the home of the only midwife in the county. And at the eastern edge of town, in the rotting laundry house that everyone had condemned, a single thin column of smoke rose from a cracked chimney each morning and no one quite knew what to make of the fact that it was still rising. To understand what those neighbors were witnessing, and what they would witness on January 14th when Tobias Lindgren knocked on her door, expecting to find her dead, we have to return to the 86 days between October 19th and the first sustained freeze, and walk through what Astrid Halvorsen actually built into those walls. Not the pieces, the system. Because what she had constructed inside that abandoned laundry house was not a smaller cabin within a larger building. It was something the frontier had not yet given a name to, but which functioned in every meaningful way as a fully insulated thermal envelope, built entirely from materials that the town of Cottonwood Falls had thrown away. To understand the system, begin with the wall. 3 months before that January morning, on October 22nd, 1886, Astrid Halvorsen drove the first nail of her interior wall into a stud she had cut from a rotten roof beam pulled out of the laundry house's own collapsing south end. She was not adding to the existing wall. She was building a second wall 4 1/4 inches inside the original wall, parallel to it, full height, full length, on all 4 sides of a 30-foot section of the building. She had measured the cavity carefully, for 1/4 inches was not arbitrary. It was the depth at which, in the hospital wards she had walked for 22 years, the outer brick wall had stopped feeling cold to the touch on the patient's side surface. It was, though she did not have the vocabulary for it, the depth at which the thermal gradient could be effectively interrupted by still, dry, layered fill. The original outer plank wall she did not repair. She left every gap, every shrunk seam, every weathered crack exactly as it was. This was deliberate. The outer wall was not meant to be airtight. It was meant to be the windbreak, a structure that broke the prairie wind's velocity and held the bulk of the snow load, but which allowed any moisture that found its way into the cavity to migrate outward and dissipate. A perfectly sealed outer wall, she had learned by watching damp hospital wards, would trap moisture inside, and trap moisture in cold weather meant death. The inner wall, by contrast, she sealed obsessively. Every plank seam was caulked with a paste she made from wood ash, clay, and rendered tallow, a recipe she had observed used by a bohemian orderly at the Minneapolis hospital who had learned it from his grandmother. The paste cured to a leathery seal that could not be cracked by ordinary thermal expansion. The inner wall was the air barrier. It had to be perfect. Between the 2 walls, in that 4 1/4 inch cavity, went the salvage. She layered it deliberately in courses like masonry. Against the cold outer wall first went a course of dry sawdust, packed lightly, never compressed, 2 inches deep. Sawdust held thousands of microscopic still air pockets, and still air. She knew from observing how the hospital's straw-tick mattresses kept patients warmer than wool blankets, was the most effective thermal insulator a builder of her era could obtain. Compressed sawdust was nearly worthless. Loose sawdust was treasure. Above that course, she packed wool batting, the torn salvage from the boarding house mattress, gently combed apart with her fingers to restore loft. Above the wool, a course of crumpled newspaper, never folded flat, always loosely balled. Above the newspaper, more sawdust. Above that, dried cattail down from the slough, which she had spent 6 full days harvesting in late October, walking through frost-stiffened reeds with a flour sack and her hands going numb. Cattail down, weight for weight, was among the warmest natural fibers known on the frontier, and it cost nothing but labor. The layering itself was the secret. A homogeneous fill, sawdust alone, or wool alone, would settle over the winter, creating cold spots at the top of the cavity. Layered fill, with each material having a different settling rate and different fiber structure, locked itself in place. The wool caught the sawdust. The newspaper bridged the wool. The cattail down filled the micro gaps the heavier materials left behind. The result was a cavity that would not settle, would not bridge thermally, and would not lose its insulating value over time. She finished the cavity walls in 19 days, working dawn to dusk alone. The ceiling was the next problem, and it was a worse one. The original sod roof was failing in 2 places, and even where it held, sod alone was not enough at 40 below. So Astrid did something the town would have considered madness if anyone had bothered to look. She built a false ceiling 18 inches below the existing roof, suspended from the same rafters, and she filled the entire cavity above that false ceiling with 18 inches of dry leaves. The leaves she had gathered through all of late October from the cottonwood grove along the creek, hauling them in her hand wagon, drying them on the dirt floor of the laundry house in the autumn sun. Dry leaves, loosely piled, are extraordinary insulation. 18 inches of dry leaves above her living space gave her, though she did not know the modern term, an effective R-value comparable to a modern fiberglass insulated attic. The leaves did one more thing she had planned for. As they slowly composted through the winter, in the narrow gap of warmth between the heated room below and the frozen sod roof above, they generated a tiny but constant supplementary heat. Not much, perhaps 3 to 5 degrees of lift. But 3 degrees on a 40 below night was the difference between 53 degrees inside and 48. The floor was the third problem. A packed dirt floor in the Minnesota Territory in January would draw heat down into frozen earth as fast as the stove could supply it. So she built a floor over the floor, rough planks salvaged from the laundry house's own collapsed sections, laid over a 4-inch bed of dry pine needles and ash, sealed at the edges to the inner wall. The pine needles broke the conductive path between her feet and the frozen ground. The ash, slightly hygroscopic, kept the cavity dry. By December 1st, the envelope was closed. Walls, ceiling, floor, all of it a continuous, layered, still-air thermal shell built around a heated volume of about 30 feet by 16 feet by 7 feet of ceiling height. Inside that envelope, she placed her stove. The stove itself was nothing remarkable. A small cast-iron parlor stove she had bought from the mercantile for $4.50, the cheapest one available. What was remarkable was where she placed it and how she fed it. She placed it not against an outer wall, where most settlers place stoves to vent through an exterior chimney, but in the dead center of her living space. The cracked stone chimney on the south wall she abandoned entirely. Instead, she ran a long horizontal stove pipe, almost 22 feet of it, across the length of the room before turning it up through a sealed roof penetration she had carefully built and lined with clay and tin. That 22-foot horizontal run was not stovepipe being inefficient. It was a heat exchanger. Every foot of pipe radiated heat into the room before the smoke escaped. By the time the exhaust gases left the building, they were carrying out only a fraction of the heat the wood had produced. She fed the stove with a method she had observed in a hospital boiler room. Small, dense charges of seasoned hardwood, banked with a layer of green ash on top to slow combustion. A single charge, properly banked, would burn for 10 to 12 hours, releasing heat slowly and evenly into the long stovepipe rather than blasting it up the chimney in the first hour. The math, though she never wrote it down in those terms, was brutal in her favor. Inside her thermal envelope, she lost heat slowly enough that 2 stove charges per day, one at dawn, one at dusk, were sufficient to hold an interior temperature in the low 50s even when the outside air was 40 below. The neighbors who saw the thin column of smoke each morning assumed her fire was small because her wood was running out. The fire was small because her wood did not need to be large. There was one more element, and it was perhaps the most quietly clever of all. Along the inside of her sealed inner wall, at waist height, she had installed a continuous shelf, 12 inches deep, running the full perimeter of her living space. On that shelf she placed, in a careful sequence, every dense, heat-storing object she had been able to gather. Stones from the creek bed, smooth and dark. Iron pots filled with sand. 2 clay crocks filled with water. A length of cast-iron stoveplate she had salvaged from the laundry house's original boiler. These are her thermal mass. Through the day, while her stove burned at its banked rate, the stones and sand and water and iron absorbed heat. Through the night, after she had banked the stove for the long sleep, those objects released the heat slowly back into the room. They flattened the temperature curve. They were the reason her interior never dropped below the high 40s, even on the worst nights, and the reason she could sleep through to dawn without rising to feed the stove. It was a hospital ward principle. The stone walls of the old Minneapolis hospital had stored daytime warmth and released it through the night. Astrid Halvorsen had simply built a stone wall on a shelf. By December 15th, when the deep cold settled in, the laundry house held a steady internal temperature in the low 50s. By January 14th, when her neighbors arrived expecting to bury her, it had held that temperature for 41 consecutive days on roughly 3/4 of a cord of wood, less than a third of what the average household in Cottonwood Falls was burning. To understand where the system came from, the story has to return one final time, past the construction, past the laughter, past even the wagon ride west, to a hospital ward in Minneapolis in the winter of 1873. Astrid Halvorsen was 33 years old that winter and had been a nurse for 9 years. The ward she walked was the charity wing of the Minneapolis County Hospital, a long, narrow, single-story brick building heated by a single coal stove at the south end and a small wood stove at the north. 40 patients lay in 2 rows of cots. The ward was perpetually cold. Patients in the middle of the room, farthest from both stoves, regularly developed pneumonia on top of whatever had brought them in. That winter, a Bohemian orderly named Václav Novak, the same orderly whose ashen tallow cock recipe would later seal her inner walls, took it upon himself, without permission from any physician, to rebuild the ward's thermal behavior using nothing but salvage materials. Astrid watched him do it over the course of 3 weeks. She watched him hang a second layer of muslin sheeting 8 inches inside the cold brick walls, with the cavity loosely stuffed with newspaper and wool rags from the laundry. She watched him line the floor under the cots with straw. She watched him place stones, heated by the kitchen stove during the day, into iron warming pans at the foot of each bed at sundown. She watched him reroute the wood stove's pipe to run 20 feet horizontally before exiting the wall. She watched him do all of it on his own time, with materials no one else valued, while the physicians ignored him. By February of 1874, the pneumonia rate in that ward had dropped by more than half. No one wrote a paper about it. No medical journal recorded it. The hospital administration, when it finally noticed, ordered the muslin sheeting taken down because it interfered with the cleaning routine. Václav Novak left the hospital that spring and disappeared into the railroad camps west of St. Paul. Astrid Halvorsen never saw him again. But she had watched. She had watched every step. She had asked questions in the quiet hours of the night shift about why the muslin had to be 8 inches inside the wall and not flush against it, about why the newspaper had to be crumpled and not folded flat, about why the stones were placed at the foot of the bed and not the head. Václav had answered every question. He had told her, in his careful, accented English, that he had learned it from his grandmother in a cold stone village in the mountains of Bohemia, and that his grandmother had told him that the cold was not an enemy to be fought, but a current to be redirected. For the next 12 years, while Astrid worked the wards through epidemics and floods and the long, slow grind of charity nursing, she carried that knowledge silently. She used pieces of it informally, a folded newspaper between a window and a cot here, a heated stone wrapped in flannel there, but she never had occasion to build a complete envelope. She never had her own walls. In the spring of 1886, when a new physician administrator dismissed her without pension after she refused to stop using ward supplies on indigent patients, the dismissal letter informed her that she had 30 days to vacate the boarding house. She had no family in the city. She had a cousin in Minnesota Territory whose last letter had arrived 8 months earlier. She packed her 2 trunks. She packed her sewing basket. And in the bottom of the trunk that held her hospital uniforms, she packed a cloth-bound ledger in which, over 12 years, she had quietly written down every single thing she had learned from watching Václav Novak rebuild that ward. The wall depths, the fill sequences, the stove placement, the thermal mass calculations she had derived by trial, the ashen tallow cock recipe, the reasoning behind each choice in her own careful handwriting. She did not yet know, when she packed that ledger, that the cousin she was riding west to find was already dead. She did not yet know that she would arrive in Cottonwood Falls with $17 and be offered an abandoned laundry house. She did not yet know that the building she would be given was, in its strange long narrowness and its single plank walls and its failing sod roof, almost exactly the proportions of the charity ward Václav Novak had rebuilt 13 years earlier. When the building was offered to her on October 19, 1886, and the bank's representative apologized for the condition and warned her that no one had successfully wintered in it, Astrid Halvorsen looked the length of the empty laundry house and felt something she had not felt since 1874. She felt that she finally had her own walls. She had the ledger. She had the principle. She had 86 days. And she had, in every direction around the town of Cottonwood Falls, the kind of cast-off salvage materials, sawdust and newspaper and wool batting and cattail down and creek stones, that the wider world considered worthless, and that she alone, of every soul in the settlement, knew how to assemble into life. By the time Tobias Lindgren and the others stepped through her doorway on the morning of January 14th, 1887, and felt that impossible wave of warmth pour out into the killing air, they were not stepping into a cabin. They were stepping into a hospital ward in Minneapolis, rebuilt in 1873 by a bohemian orderly whose name none of them had ever heard, transmitted across 13 years and 400 miles by a woman they had assumed was making a fatal mistake. Astrid Halvorsen poured them coffee. She did not explain the walls. When Per Lindgren, sitting near the long horizontal stovepipe, finally asked her how the building was warm, she only said that she had spent 22 years watching how warmth was kept in places that ought to have been cold, and that most of what she had done, anyone could do if they were willing to gather what other people threw away. By February, 3 families in Cottonwood Falls had asked her to help them rebuild their walls. By the spring of 1887, the ashen tallow caulk recipe was being mixed in 5 households. By the autumn of that year, the cattail slough at the south edge of town had been picked clean by half the settlement gathering down for cavity fill. The schoolmaster Daniel Whitcomb, who had walked past her building in November believing she had given up, became her closest collaborator and eventually wrote a small pamphlet on cold weather building that circulated quietly through 3 counties before being lost to a print shop fire in 1894. Astrid Halvorsen lived in the converted laundry house for 19 more years. She never married. She nursed the town's sick without charge, accepting only firewood and salvage materials in payment. When she died in the autumn of 1906, the building she had built was still warm, still standing, still holding its layered walls and its long horizontal pipe and its perimeter shelf of creek stones. The town buried her in the small cemetery north of the schoolhouse and let the building stand empty, in respect, for 2 more winters before a young couple moved in and lived there themselves until 1923. The ledger she had carried west, the cloth-bound book in which she had written down everything Václav Novak had taught her, was placed in the Cottonwood Falls County Records office after her death. It sat in a drawer for 41 years. In 1947, a county clerk cleaning out old files nearly threw it away as worthless. A schoolteacher who happened to be standing in the office that afternoon recognized what she was holding and asked to keep it. That ledger is the only reason any of this story is still known. What Astrid Halvorsen built into the walls of that abandoned laundry house was not, in the end, a building technique. It was a transmission. It was the bohemian grandmother's knowledge, carried by an orderly to a ward in Minneapolis, watched and recorded by a young nurse, carried west in the bottom of a trunk, and finally, in the 86 days before the iron cold of January 1887, built into walls of her own. The frontier remembers many things, and forgets more than it remembers. It remembers the men who claimed the land, and the men who cut the rails, and the men whose names ended up on the maps. It tends to forget the women who watched and listened and wrote things down in ledgers and waited for 13 years for the chance to use what they knew. If you have ever stood in a quiet, well-built room on a brutally cold night and felt the warmth hold steady against the dark outside, you have stood inside something Astrid Halvorsen understood. She did not invent it. She carried it, and in carrying it, she kept alive long enough for it to reach us. That is, perhaps, the quietest and most enduring kind of building any pioneer ever did.